Hello and welcome to the Forest is Forest podcast. My name is Nikki and I'm a podcast producer for Wildwood Arts. And in this episode, I'll be finding out about one of the more iconic musical traditions of the Forest, the brass band, as I join Forest of Dean Brass on one of the first Sunday afternoon practice sessions for a while. But first, I take a trip to the Onward Hall in Yorkley to speak to historian Roger Deeks as he explains to me how the brass band movement first began in the Forest.
The musical tradition in the Forest of Dean goes back a very long time. There were drum and fife bands, small wind bands, but it was around the time of the growth of the iron industry that we can see brass bands being formed in the Forest. And in the history books, Merthyr Tydfil is attributed to having the first recognised brass band, that is of workers working in the iron foundry there at Cyfarthfa. And that was owned by a man called Robert Crawshay. And in fact, it was his son, Henry Crawshay, who developed the iron industry in the Forest of Dean. And one of the earliest mentions we find of a brass band that's related to a local industry is the Crawshay Band. So it's interesting that that name was there, it was attached to the ironworks, and that band actually was called later on the Ironworks Band. So that's the first indicator of the idea of what we would call a brass band.
And it was around the middle of the 19th century that the ironwork industry became more organised, and employers such as the Crawshays were looking at ways of keeping the workforce occupied in their spare time.
The employers recognised that one of the problems was drink and illiteracy, and they were quite keen to see an improvement in workers' education, lifestyle. They therefore were keen to invest in anything that they felt would occupy their workers and lead to what they called moral improvement. Why it was moral improvement, I don't know. I think that was just because it brought them out of the pubs.
By the late 1850s, the coal industry was starting to escalate in the area, bringing more investment, larger collieries, and an increase in popularity in the brass band movement.
During the real heyday, about 1890, 1900, you would find almost every single colliery, Trafalgar Colliery, Princess Royal Colliery, you fancy, all of them had a brass band attached to them.
And the colliery owners were very supportive.
The employers were very helpful to begin with because they did subsidise the instruments, the uniforms, the facilities, but slowly the bands took that upon themselves, so they became autonomous.
The bands began to disassociate themselves from the collieries and became more closely aligned with their local village, often renaming themselves in the process.
So, for instance, New Fancy Brass Band had become Park End Brass Band. Eventually, the Princess Royal Brass Band became the Bream Brass Band. So the bands slowly detached themselves from the industries that you could say gave birth to them.
It quickly became apparent that these newly founded brass bands were in dire need of somewhere to rehearse that was cheap and quick to build.
Numerous bands at the time couldn't afford the investment in a major permanent building, but bought these buildings off the peg. So they were what we call iron buildings, corrugated metal buildings that came from suppliers. And in fact, at the time, they were being used all over the world. So they were built very quickly, usually as a temporary measure. Well, of course, what's temporary often, persists, especially if it's well built.
One of these so-called temporary buildings is where we are standing today, in the Onward Hall. It was erected in 1915 and is said to have cost just £100. It
was a venture between the workers and the local mine owner, who also actually owned the local pub, who was quite keen to see a facility that was outside of the pub, independent and autonomous. And this particular building, the Onward Hall, was used for showing films. If we look behind us, you can see up there is a projection room, and there was a hole in that. And in fact, as well as rehearsing the brass band, it was a regular cinema venue. The stage was used by the brass band, but it was also used for theatre. So touring troupes would perform here. And today it still gets used for a variety of uses as well as the brass band. They have a wonderfully well supported bingo evening in the hall. So it's still got a very valued and important community use.
Over the last year, during the lockdown, things have been rather quiet in the Onward Hall and the band's rehearsals have all been put on hold. But now that the restrictions are starting to relax a little, a few of the members have been practicing outdoors, and very kindly, they invited me along.
1, 2, 3.
I'm Becky, and I play Flugelhorn. So I've been playing brass since I was 8. It's a natural thing to do when you're a child in the Salvation Army, is to pick up an instrument and learn.
I'm Sharon Stratford. I play second cornet with Forest of Dean brass. I've been playing it since I was 7. Back in my age group, there was only brownies for the kids to do with the village. So my next door neighbour said, do you fancy coming round for a little practice and blow and try the band out? My husband plays B-flat bass in the band. My son George plays E-flat bass in the band. And my other son, the older son Benjamin, plays in Tredegar band down in South Wales.
My name's Marion and I'm the actual band manager. So my main task is to feed information between the conductor or the committee back to the band. Under normal circumstances, it would be when we're preparing to go somewhere, I issue them with instructions on where to go, what time to be there, what uniform we might be wearing on that day. So it's just a more of an information thing.
And in normal times, they would be very busy.
We'd be out nearly every weekend, maybe even 2 events on a Saturday and 2 on a Sunday. We do anything from concerts in pub gardens, steam rallies, bandstands, paid ones where people invite us to come and do a performance. I've been playing since I was about 12. I'm a baritone, which is actually not the lowest in the band. Obviously we've got the basses and then you have your euphoniums. Baritone is a bit of an unsung hero. Tends to sit between a euphonium and a horn, and it plays normally a lot of inner parts, a lot of harmony parts. One of the sayings is always, you never notice them when they're there, but you really notice when they're not there. So we sort of hold things together a lot of the time. But it's a lovely solo instrument as well. Same range as a euphonium, but a slightly different sound to it. Some people would say a little bit more edgy, but I think it's just nicer.
So traditionally, brass bands have brass instruments and they have percussion. So this one's a flugelhorn, so you only have one of these in a brass band. You have 9 cornets. And then you have horns and baritones, euphoniums, trombones, and then you have the basses, which are the big ones. And then obviously the drums. Most of the smaller instruments have 3 valves, and that's how you get the different notes. But essentially it's just a tube, a length of tube.
When you start in the beginning, it's quite difficult and you sort of sound a little bit like an elephant on a bad day, but it's all down to practice.
And a lot of technique.
It's what they call the embouchure, which is getting a vibration on the lip, but with an open mouth, so you get as much air through the instrument as possible. Important thing is to breathe properly. A lot of people don't take enough breath before they start, so you need to support the sound all the time. And it is just a technique to get vibration, and once you've sort of got it, it's just a continual practice thing to improve on it, and it just gets easier the more you do it.
My name's Benjamin Hamilton Waddington and I'm 16 years old. I've played with Forest of Dean Brass Band for the last 2 years. I play percussion. My uncle bought me a little drum kit as a kid. It sort of just stemmed from there really, I think.
I'm Paul, I'm Becky's husband who plays Flugelhorn. I'm just acting conductor at the moment. I just basically make sure everybody plays together. Without a conductor, it all falls to pieces even more, but we all have a good time, good fun anyway, so that's what it's all about.
You'd normally find Paul playing a huge range of instruments in the percussion section, alongside Ben.
Some things that included like a xylophone, which is like a wooden instrument with sort of small resonators, so it creates more of hit sounds. It's quite attack based. You've got a vibraphone, which is used to be used in jazz, and it's more metalized. And then it's also got a motor on it, so causing it to create more of a wah sound.
The instruments we've got now are probably a full orchestra. From a triangle to a bass drum, anything now, we have to play it.
And it's all this versatility that should help Ben reach his goal.
My dream is really I want to join the Royal Marines Band Service. Hoping to join the percussion section in there, which is quite vigorous training, but then you get to do music as your job.
So it's coming up 27 years ago that we amalgamated to form Forest of Dean Brass. And the reason that came about is Yorkley had lost its sponsorship, so actually it was financially in not a good place, and Colford Town Band was probably financially in a good place, but its band room was in disrepair.
So the two bands joined together and the Onward Hall became their home.
We've been looking at renovating the hall for some time now. It was put up in, I think, 1913, and it was a second-hand building there. So essentially it's just a prefab building that's been there for over 100 years. So understandably it's in need of some TLC.
So the band has taken it upon themselves to restore it to its former glory.
We've had surveys done and it is savable, which is really, really good.
They've already had substantial grants, one of £10,000 from West Dean District Council, and they're hoping to get more as they progress. They've committed something like 400 volunteer hours already to the repair and refurbishment of the building. They're going to insulate it properly, have sustainable low-carbon form of heating. They really are going to set about making this a room for the future, and perhaps for generations of young people, which I think would be terrific.
We just want that hall to continue to serve the community for as long as it can, really, and be able to say that we've done our bit for our generation, and on to the next it will go.
If you would like to find out how the Onward Hall renovations are progressing and how you are able to best support them, then please head over to the band's website at www.forestofdeanbrass.org. Now finally, before I say goodbye, this is the poem Brass Roots, a collaboration between Rob and Barb Morgan from Ledbrook Band and poet Beth Calverley as part of the Wildwood Arts Style of Poet sessions recorded back in July 2020.
Brass Roots. You met in the band, conducted by the waves of fate, and in that moment you could sense many decades worth of music to be made. The mellow instruments are best, the upturned notes of neighbours talking to each other from their roots. Brass grows in the heart like grief or joy, shared together, a family extended into sound. On the banks of the Wye, you let your metal flowers out, deep and purposeful. A river of movement, a history of homegrown laughter, mined like coal, to make this rooted forest whole.
You have been listening to the Forest is Forest podcast, brought to you with thanks to the National Lottery Heritage Fund.